Welcome to the Nonviolent Jesus podcast. I'm John, Father John Deere, and today I'm speaking with Professor Kate Common. This is a project of www.beatitudecenter.org, where you can find many other podcasts and regular Zoom programs on the nonviolence of Jesus and practicing nonviolence and working for a more just, more nonviolent world. So let's begin as usual with just a little prayer. So I invite everyone, wherever you are, just to take in a deep breath and just to relax and recenter yourself. And together let's enter into the presence of the God of peace, who loves you infinitely and personally and everyone everywhere. And we welcome the risen nonviolent Jesus here with us. Let's just take a moment to ask for whatever grace we need to follow the nonviolent Jesus more faithfully and to do God's will. God of peace, thank you for all the blessings of life, love, and peace that you give us. Be with us now as we reflect together on your call to follow the nonviolent Jesus and to work for a more nonviolent, more just world. Bless us, inspire us, disarm us, strengthen us, and send us to do your will, to do our part, to help end war and poverty, racism, greed, injustice, nuclear weapons, and environmental destruction, and all violence, that we might be your holy peacemakers and welcome your reign of universal love, nonviolence, and peace on earth. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, friends, it's a great blessing to welcome author and professor Kate Common to the Nonviolent Jesus podcast. One way to look at our predicament is to name the great blasphemies and heresies of our time, which are, to my mind, Christian nationalism and Christian Zionism. And much of this goes back to the book of Joshua and its portrayal of God as a violent, militaristic war maker who leads Israel to a new conquest, to kill everyone, to get to the promised land and create a new war-making empire. And that set the stage for the long, horrific story of Christian imperialism and Christian war-making to a false god of war who's based in large part on these stories, this origin story of the Hebrew community and the formation of empire. So, for example, the white European colonialists who killed millions of indigenous people and enslaved millions of Africans invoked this image of God, as did the white racists who created South Africa's apartheid, as well as Trump's cult followers who stormed the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021 in an act of violent insurrection. And of course, these texts in Joshua are used nonstop today by Netanyahu and his war makers and Christian Zionists to kill Palestinians and commit genocide. Along comes Professor Kate Common in her new book called Undoing Conquest, Ancient Israel, the Bible, and the Future of Christianity, which is just published by Orbis. And I urge everyone to get it because I think it's presents a real original study on the origins of the Hebrew community. Kate Common tells us in her book, it's hard to even explain, about a newly uncovered history of the Hebrew people, which to my mind changes everything and will hopefully end the long history of conquest within Christian colonialism, theology, and practice. Dr. Kate Common is the assistant professor of public and practical theology at Methodist Theological School in Ohio and the theologian in residence at St. John's Episcopal Church in Northampton, Massachusetts. You can find out more about her at her website, katecommon.com. That's KATECOMMON.com. Professor Kate Common, welcome to the Nonviolent Jesus podcast.
Oh, it's wonderful to be here with you, Father John. Thank you for this invitation.
So glad to have you. So, Kate, I was speaking this weekend at Grace Cathedral in San Francisco about my new book, Universal Love and Jesus and Nonviolence, which is my life's work. And someone came up to me at the end of my talk and said, I don't believe any of that. what you're saying about a God of universal love and nonviolence. What about the book of Joshua and the Battle of Jericho and God telling the Israelis to go and kill for the promised land? I was quite shocked because I'd never been asked that directly in my whole life, and I was thinking of you all weekend. So before we get into your book and the great breakthrough that you're going to propose, tell us the problem. So that means for me, what happened in the book of Joshua as a story of conquest, blessed by God or divinely inspired by God, which is basically the story of the creation of Israel as a war-making empire. And then later we'll look on that as a basis for Christian empire and war-making. So I guess I'm asking you to review the story of the biblical God of violence first and conquest.
Yeah, thank you, John. And what a surprising question, but a good question that you heard this weekend about what about the book of Joshua? So let me just start by saying that before we can get to the book of Joshua, we have to look at the book of Exodus. And the Exodus is setting up a story where the Hebrew people are enslaved in Egypt, the empire of the day. They're being mistreated, abused. It's very unjust. And they cry out to their God. And this God, it says, hears their cries and is upset by the injustices that are happening. And, as the story goes, eventually through different plagues and different hardening of Pharaoh's heart, eventually the Egyptians let the Israelites or the Hebrew people go. Now, there is violence in the book of Exodus, but it's a different kind of violence. It's actually, you could say, natural disasters or divine violence, but the violence is not the Hebrew people attacking their aggressors. In fact, when we first meet Moses, he actually kills an Egyptian slave driver. And this is actually kind of looked down upon even by the Hebrew enslaved people. He's driven out of Egypt. And so violence is sort of ambivalent in the Exodus narrative. But what's not is that God hears the cries of the marginalized and makes a way for them to escape. And then these ancient Israelites, ancient Hebrew people are wandering through the wilderness for 40 years, and God's promising them this promised land. And something happens as we enter into the book of Joshua. It's something I described in the book as narrative whiplash, or you could say story whiplash. Like, how do we get from here to there? Because what happens in the book of Joshua is suddenly human violence is condoned, not just violence, but genocide by this very God that made a way out of Egypt without calling the Israelites to take up arms. But suddenly, as they get to the ancient land of Canaan, they stand on the banks of the Jordan River. God is calling Joshua to lead an army into the land of Canaan and to take that land by force. And so this is where we first hear that famous sort of Sunday school song, or the African-American spiritual, Joshua fought the battle of Jericho and the walls came crumbling down. If you really look at the text in Joshua, it's a very violent and genocidal text. It says that after the Israelite people marched around Jericho and blew the shofar and the walls came crumbling down, that the Israelite army kills everyone in Jericho. This includes the young and the old, the men and the women, the children, and even the livestock. According to the narrative, no one is left alive. And that as the book of Joshua progresses, it is a story of this army of God going town by town in ancient Canaan and killing everyone. And so this story has a genocidal imagination. And it's a very different imagination than we meet in the Exodus. And so already we can start to hear these different contradictions, different types of stories, different types of images of God and the role of violence reverberating through these stories that we've inherited in the Hebrew text. So yeah, that's the book of Joshua. And even in the book of Joshua, even though it describes a genocide happening, these Canaanites who were supposedly all killed keep showing up. They show up. They haven't actually been completely wiped out, as the narrative might suggest, but it's more complicated than that.
So briefly, though, Kate, I know this is a stupid question. And I reread those first chapters of Joshua this morning for the first time in 40 years, and they scared the daylights out of me. Because, right, you're saying they blow the horns, and there's all this procession around the city of Jericho, and then it just says the walls came down, and the Israelites went and killed every man, woman, young, old, all. So it's total genocide. This is to get the promised land, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So, friends, listeners, Kate Common has written a new book called Undoing Conquest. And my friend, the publisher of Orbis Books, Robert Ellsberg, told me, you have to get Kate to talk about this because this is totally original and groundbreaking. Because, Kate, you announced to the world recent archaeological evidence. Archaeology, Kate, from the highland settlements story from the Iron Age, which offers physical proof of the actual historical origins of the Hebrew community, which are completely the opposite of the Joshua story of genocide, that in fact the Hebrew community in Canaan, and it just makes me want to cry, was the result of an indigenous, nonmilitaristic, peaceful, organic settlement into the highlands, which began a peaceful, egalitarian, and just community. And it happened 500 years before the Battle of Jericho. And that's the real beginning of the Hebrew community. And then later, in my imagination, Kate, as you were reading your book, I jumped and go to Jesus, and I'm going, well, then everything makes sense. So walk us through how you learned about this, the archaeology, and what the evidence shows.
Yeah, and I will back up just a step and say, part of this conversation really invites us as readers of the Bible to start to learn about our Bible more and to understand the different ways that the Bible reports history, including the conquest narrative. And so part of our work and part of the work that I invite you into the book is to start to see that not all histories operate in the same way. They're not all written as if there's a reporter there on the ground saying, this is how it happened. This is how the Hebrew people entered the land of Canaan. That some biblical histories do something very differently and are seeking to do something very differently. So I want to just put that out there for everyone to keep in the back of their minds and to just say that until we had developed as humans the field of archaeology, our understanding of the Israelite history or the Hebrew history was limited to the Bible because that's all we had. That's all we knew about. We didn't have a window into what else could have been going on during these time periods because all we had left or preserved were the texts. But 100 years ago, that all changed. So while this is new archaeological information, it's new in the big history of Christianity or the Jewish traditions, but it's not that new in our lifetime. This information has been out there. And what I've done in the book is I've condensed it and interpreted it specifically for Christians. What do we do with this new information? So let's get into it. What is this information? So flashback 100 years ago or so, archaeology is a new science just getting underway. And the story goes that early biblical archaeologists, many of these were sort of biblical literalist Christians, entered into the land of Palestine. This was before the nation state of Israel. They went into the land, the Holy Land, and it's said with a Bible in one hand and a spade in the other. And so they were trusting the history of the Bible, specifically the Joshua story. And if you read the Joshua story like you did this morning, you'll see it's very specific. It's like they went to Jericho. Then they went to Ai and they destroyed Ai. And then they went to these other cities. So these early archaeologists figured, hey, this is a blueprint for us to find in the archaeological record Joshua and his conquest. because archaeologists like a good conquest or like a good battle, because battles leave a lot behind. They leave walls that fell down, they leave destruction sites, they leave weapons. So you can see when a battle happened typically, because all those things can get preserved. So they started going from site to site, and they're digging around. And first of all, they met a lot of contradictions. Sure, there was some evidence of battles, but these battles were from very different time periods. In fact, some of them several hundred years apart. Like, it wasn't the same kind of weapons, it wasn't the same kind of destruction. And so it didn't add up. So at first it started to just not add up, that this was one empire or one army marching through city by city on a campaign to destroy everyone. And, archaeologists can find that if that's the case. But they couldn't find it. So that's kind of, you could say, problem number one. But then something else occurred. Archaeologists started to discover something completely unexpected. They weren't looking for it, but it was so ubiquitous that it just kept showing up. And what they discovered was that the time period of when the conquest supposedly happened, and let's, if I had a timeline, which I will when I present this visually in a few weeks, we'll zoom out and say this is 1,200 years before Jesus. So we're talking 1,200 BCE, the end of the Bronze Age, the beginning of the Iron Age. This is when Israel first enters the scene, when we first have historical record of Israel. And this is supposedly, that's, biblical scholars believe this is when Joshua, did his campaign. This is when they came into the Promised Land. But rather than finding sites of destruction at this time period, they started to uncover hundreds of small farming villages in the highland regions of current-day Israel and Palestine. And these highland regions, if you're familiar with the geography, is the interior of Israel and Palestine, away from the Mediterranean Sea. Right along the shoreline is very lush, flat, farmland, very green, very agriculturally rich. At this time period, 1,200 years ago, there were cities in that lush green area. These city-states ruled the area, and they were vassal cities that answered to Pharaoh. Egypt controlled that entire region. Where we see these villages cropping up are not in that rich, fertile land, but a little further inland, where the foothills of mountains start to happen. And this is known as the Rocky Highland regions. This was a rocky place to be, not great farmland, not easily navigatable, but we start to see hundreds of new villages cropping up. And that these villages were designed almost as circles. They were constructed with, you could say, rectangular houses kind of built right next to each other to create a circular pattern. And the interior of these villages was like an interior courtyard. And that each of these villages was made up about 10 to 15 of these homes that would have housed about 10 to 15 people. So they're small villages, 100 to 150 people each. And we can tell by the archaeological record that these were not a warring people. There were no weapons in these villages. The other thing we can find out about these people through the archaeological record is that there was no clear distinction between classes. There was not a sort of a palace elite that you would see down in the lowlands in these Canaanite city-states, where there was clearly a king who had lots of wealth and lots of weapons and lots of gold. These small villages, everyone had the same thing. And we know that because the burial sites, no one was buried with luxury goods. There wasn't a clear chief who had all of this stuff. Everybody was kind of equal. We know now, too, that these villages grew exponentially over a very short period of time, that it couldn't have all just been natural birth rates, that very likely word got out about these new villages and people were coming in from all over to this place. The other thing we know about these villages is that they were largely a cultural carryover from the Canaanites that would have been inhabiting that lowland region. So some of these people were locals, indigenous. A lot of them were. but it wasn't just limited to that. And we also know from these villages that this is where the start of the Hebrew language got started. We see in these villages the abecedaries, or literally the development of the Hebrew language carved into pottery, as if somebody was practicing their ABCs. And so all of this information started to turn up over a few decades of biblical archaeology, from, you could say, the 1930s through the 1960s, 1970s. And the story just, the evidence just kept pouring in. And it was very clear that something happened during this time period, but it wasn't a conquest. It was actually a construction of new communities. And what was special about these new communities is that even though they were very close to, say, the Canaanite city-states that were ruled by Egypt, and that Egypt very much had a presence in these lowlands, that these people were off the grid of empire. And what do I mean by that? I mean, literally, the Egyptian empire couldn't deal with this movement that was happening in the highlands, because they literally had horses and chariots, and they were not made for the off-road. They couldn't get up into the Rocky Highland regions. And so the Egyptian empire ruled with an army that depended on horses and chariots. And so these people were out of the way. They couldn't be attacked by Egypt. And so they were allowed to proliferate during this around 200-year period, from 1200 to about 1000 BCE. And their numbers grew exponentially. And this is essentially what most biblical scholars and archaeologists name as the origins of the Hebrew people in Canaan. That these were the proto-Israelite settlements that eventually led to an Israelite identity and what we know as ancient Israel, and what we meet in the biblical text.
So you're saying
Israel.
It's pretty widely accepted now, the archaeology of the highland settlements and this new interpretation of the actual history of the origins of the Hebrew community.
Yes, it is widely accepted across biblical scholarship and archaeological discourse.
Wow.
And that's Jewish scholars, Christian scholars, agnostic scholars just working in the region. And that this has been known and interpreted since the 1950s. Biblical scholars in particular, have kind of refined their interpretation. Were these largely indigenous people? Was it a peasant revolt? A peasant revolt, of peasants leaving the Canaanite city-states and going up into the hills. These were different ideas that were tossed around, to now sort of the one that's mostly accepted is this idea of the Hebrew people emerging as an indigenous origins movement, that because of the pressure of empire and a piece that we haven't talked about yet, climate change, that folks went into the hills to start a new way of life, to deal with climate change and to do something different than and in contrast to empire.
It all makes sense to me, your argument. And friends, listeners, we, don't have enough time to get into all of this. I really do encourage you to get this book, Kate's book, Undoing Conquest. So 2 next big things, which is impossible to say shortly, but I know you'll do your best. So this happened, but then 500 years later, they tell a different story of themselves as being sent by God to conquest, to kill everyone in Jericho, I suppose, and elsewhere, and take the land and live on it. And so that's number 1, that story of Joshua. Number 2, Christians take that story and run with it. We won't even have to talk about anybody else, and have used it throughout the horrible Christian history of conquest and genocide. Literally up to, now it's used and invoked, as opposed to, let's say, the Sermon on the Mount. Love your enemies, offer no violent resistance to one who does evil. Blessed are the peacemakers. That's not used much at all. So 2 more big questions. How did we get Joshua? And a few thoughts on the Christian history of genocide based on the text of Joshua.
Yeah, these are great questions. We're really getting into the heart of it now. So you have this peaceful movement of people moving out of empire, let's just say. And we start to meet these people in the biblical texts if you know where to look for them. You can see their echoes in Judges. What happens in Judges? That these groups of people, they don't have a king. When danger happens, they come together. They tribally join together. They fight off the danger. They go back to their ways of life afterwards. But things start to change around 1000, so 200 years into this experiment, let's say. And what changes is that the Philistines enter. Think of David and Goliath. And the Philistines, unlike the Egyptians, they weren't bound by horses and chariots. These were kind of a brute force that sailed across the Mediterranean looking for new lands to inhabit. And they enter onto the scene, and they start attacking these villages, who by at this point have taken on the identity of Israelite or Hebrew. And the people get scared, and they decide they want a king. And you can hear this story play out in Samuel 8, I think, First Samuel 5 or 8. I'm forgetting the verse, but basically, you probably have heard it, where the Israelite people go to Samuel and say, "We want a king," and Samuel says, "No, you don't want a king. The Lord says if you get a king, you're going to get enslaved, you're going to be put to work, you're going to have to pay taxes, and you're going to have to fight the king's wars." But the people were like, "No, we want a king. We're scared. Like, the king will protect us." And I mean, you can hear some of these echoes all the way down to today. And Samuel kept saying, no kings. You don't want a king. But finally, God was kind of like, you know what? If the people want a king, let them have it. And so this starts a different history of ancient Israel. You can say this is the history of Israel as a kingdom. And we meet this kingdom in the text. In First and Second Kings and Samuel, we learn about David and Solomon. And this starts a different type of history. We could say a historical history around a very particular, very small kingdom in the ancient Near East, and its history of dealing with powerful empires. And so ancient Israel was first a united kingdom, and then it divided. We had Israel in the north and Judah in the south. And we're going through hundreds of years of history now. But I want to put this out there. These people never had a conquest story. Conquest wasn't even on the minds of these people. These were people that emerged historically through this indigenous movement. And so scholars think they had an Exodus story. The Exodus spoke to this movement into the hills, away from Egypt, away from the oppressors and enslavement of Egypt, into starting these new villages. But there was no conquest story yet. And again, these people are inventing their language, and they're creating their stories. They're writing their stories down, but no conquest story yet. Not until we fast forward to 722. So here we are. We're 400 years later, and something terrible has happened. The kingdom in the north, Israel, has been taken over, conquered, quite literally conquered by the Assyrian Empire.
And this were really brutal, right? They were one of the worst people. Yeah,
they were putting people up on pikes.
Think of Pol Pot in the Nazis.
Yeah, this is evil.
Real evil. And they're a big factor throughout the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah. And they're later. Mm-hmm. This is later. This is 400 years later. The people in the north are terrorized, conquered, violently, murdered. And a lot of refugees go down to Judah. The capital of Judah is Jerusalem. And that's the southern kingdom of this ancient group of people, Israel and the Judahites. And so they saw what happened in the north. And you could say that the conquest story itself was born out of the trauma that the Assyrians afflicted. And so the people in the south are thinking, oh my God, they're coming for us. This was a very precarious situation. And so you can have compassion for the leaders at this time who said, you know what? We're not a warring people. We came out of the hills. We are these peaceful people. The Hebrew prophets have been calling us to account to do the work of God, which is the work of justice. But we got a real problem here with the Assyrians. We need to kind of prop ourselves up. We need to, kind of start to see ourselves in the image of an empire that can stand up to people like the Assyrians. And so the theory is that during this time, during the reign of King Josiah, that they started, the leaders of ancient Judah started to recraft their history in the image of something like Assyria. And that's where the conquest story got born. And it was an attempt for these traumatized people to say, wait a minute, we're not just bullied by empire, we're like empire too, so don't mess with us. And so the conquest story gets written. Parts of the Hebrew Bible as we have it, scholars theorize, got written during this time, parts of Deuteronomy. Some theological themes like covenant got born during this time, and all in an effort to try to keep the southern state of Judah safe, sort of ideologically, but even, physically. These texts get born, and you can read in 2 Kings 22, if you have this lens of these leaders writing new texts because they're scared and because they're dealing with Assyria, you see in 2 Kings 22 that King Josiah does a temple renovation. And lo and behold, during that temple renovation, a new book is found. Well, this is a very common motif from that time, that whenever new texts or histories are being written, that the king of the time finds a new book. And so we can see this happening in the in the Hebrew Bible itself. It's kind of self-reporting on this. And so and those texts were, the Second Kings text was written by the same people that were writing the conquest narrative. And so now the Israelite tradition and the theological texts start to take a turn. And the story of conquest is suddenly inserted as a new history of these people.
It's just incredible. I mean, for interrupting, we don't have too much time, but we see this story playing out in the headlines today. But you're saying that this peaceful people who then get totally run over by this horrific, brutal empire, the Assyrians, then retell their stories. Well, we're like the Assyrians now, and we're going to always be like the Assyrians, and that's the way God wants us to. So then we get Jesus coming along after the prophets and talking about some kind of strange vision of equality and egalitarianism and justice and even peace in Isaiah. And he's really advocating universal love and nonviolence. But we Christians reject that, come up with the just war theory, and then the next thing you know, we're choosing the conquest narrative again, and we take it for ourselves and have done all this horrific stuff. You go through it in the book. Just tell us a little bit about that, and then I want to ask you about Jesus, and then we'll probably have to wrap it up. I know this is ridiculous to ask you these big themes in just minutes, but maybe to the listeners, it'll give a taste of this important work that Kate is presenting to us all.
Yeah, and I mean, these are such good questions. And I will just say that, so you can already see by the history I've just told you that there was different strands of histories happening in ancient Israel and the Hebrew people. We have this strong prophetic tradition that you could say links back to these highland settlement villages that had a very almost utopic, if egalitarian-ish kind of ethos that you could say you hear all the time in the Hebrew prophets. And then you have this idea of a Hebrew God being one of war, like Assyria. So by the time Jesus comes onto the scene, again, this is 500 years after the conquest narrative would have been written. The Israelites had the story of conquest, but they were never conquerors. They were always getting bullied. In fact, after the conquest narrative was written, 20 years later, Babylonian Empire conquers Judah and takes everyone into Babylonian exile. Mm-hmm. So these people themselves never lived out this violent narrative. And so when Jesus comes onto the scene, he is very much grounded, even as a northern person from Galilee, in this Hebrew prophetic tradition. That he was calling out, he was very much a Jewish man, very much drawing on his own traditions. You see the first scroll he reads is Isaiah. He's saying, look, let's get back to these ideals of caring for everyone. These were Hebrew ideals. He wasn't doing something new. He was just leaning into the tradition he inherited and doing that, you could say, practical theology work of saying, let's get back to this. Let's do this. This is who we are. We don't need to work with Rome. Rome is the empire. They're oppressing us. So when you start to read Jesus and understand this Hebrew prophetic tradition and even the highland settlements tradition, you can see where Jesus is just in this long continuum of this kind of thinking, this nonviolent, anti-empire, if you will, thinking. And so then ironically, we have a Christianity around 300, 400 AD after Christ dies that suddenly, for the first time, becomes linked up with the power of empire.
Mm.
And so this entire time, the early Christian church, the Jewish people, they had the story of conquest, but they never had the power of empire. The ancient Christians never had the power of empire. The ancient Jewish Hebrew people never had the power of empire. It's not until 325 onwards that this marriage between Christianity and empire starts to link up. We really see it take shape in the Crusades and then on down to where we're standing right now. But somehow along the lines, especially 500 years ago, European colonialism did something very distinct, which was they co-opted this violent conquest story and they read themselves into the text as the Israelites. They read any land they wanted to take as a new promised land and any indigenous people that happened to be in their new promised land as Canaanite. And so this story, as co-opted by Christian empire, the story of Joshua's conquest became a template for real life European genocide all around the globe.
That's why I wanted to have you on the show, because this is so important, and yet it's hard to take it all in. Keep going.
It really is. And so it's like the problem with the conquest story isn't that it was written, isn't that it's in our biblical text. It's that Christian empires claimed it as a template for their own real world land taking, genocide, and settler colonialism. And so they use it as a justification to go into places like North America or South Africa and say, you know what? These Native Americans, they're just like the Canaanites. We can do with them what we will. We can kill them. We can enslave them. We can do whatever we want. This is our land. God's giving it to us. We're the new Israel. And so it was a complete appropriation, co-option of this story. And whereas it never played out historically in any conquest for Judaism or ancient Christianity, it did in the last 500 years. And we're still living in that theological imagination. Well, so much so that we hear it echoed. Yeah. Pete Hegseth is echoing conquest narrative in his framing of the holy war against Iran.
It's horrific. So, Kate, I suppose we'll have to wrap it up. But, my work has been to try to get folks to reclaim the nonviolence of Jesus and to take the Sermon on the Mount as seriously as Gandhi did. He read it every day. And then to reclaim the imagination of our God as a God of universal love and peace and, dare I say, nonviolence. So you have this powerful title, Undoing Conquest. I think you're laying out a whole new take on our whole religious Judeo-Christian history. But there's good news in it, which is the original origins of the Hebrew community in the Highland story. The idea maybe that Jesus is drawing on that and that it all begins to make sense, his journey, and how we have rejected all of that, but we can still choose our story, I guess you could say. And you're inviting us to be part of undoing conquest. So, and to reclaim that maybe original Hebrew community image in the Highlands as an egalitarian, just, nonmilitaristic, that's your word, community, and therefore Jesus as a community of nonviolence. You end the book with a question, and I guess I thought maybe we might end there. You could please tell us whatever you want in these last couple of minutes. What might God be calling the church to do or to be now in light of what you're sharing with us, in light of the Hebrew settlements story as the origin of the Hebrew community, and how that opens up our new awareness of what we've done inciting with the Joshua story, and therefore Christian colonialism and conquest and violence and genocide and empire, and really, really digging into the gospel story of justice, peace, and nonviolence. Give us your concluding thoughts.
Well, I sat with that question a lot because it's one thing to hear a new history like this, but it's another thing to let it shape our identity as Christians and our faith practice. And so I didn't want to end this book with just writing a book on this. In chapter 5, I take a turn towards practice and I say, how do we start to integrate this? What does the story teach us to do as the church? And so I propose an entirely new liturgical season called the Season of Origins, which would do a few things to help us undo conquest. First, it would invite this new story into our faith practice. It would be a chance for us to learn together about our Hebrew Highland settlement ancestors, to learn about where this conquest story came about. So it would be a season of a 4-week season like Advent, where we can start to learn these stories, know our Bible better, know our history better. But it wouldn't end there. It would be an invitation for the church to then, from a restorative justice practice, say, you know what? We've inherited not only the conquest story, but centuries of Christian violence and conquest. And we need to be the folks that are going to do some repair now on that. And so the Season of Origins invites us to do the very real, tangible, restorative justice work that needs to be done. It centers it in the church year. And the 4 weeks of Origins, each week is a different theme, but the first week invites new stories like the Hebrew Highland settlements. The second week, name, is a chance for the church to really look at our history and name the atrocities and the violence that's there. The third week is the week of repair, and that's where the church can start to gather together and say, what do we need to do to start to repair and heal these histories? And then the fourth week of Origins turns to imagine. Where do we want to go? Where do we want to be as the church? And so I very much end Undoing Conquest with this call to action and justice. And the last 2 years, I've been working with churches around the country and even around the globe, in Europe and Canada and elsewhere, to start to breathe life into this new liturgical season that can help the church really do the work of undoing conquest. And so it's a really exciting time. You can find more about the Season of Origins and the projects that have been coming out of it with churches around the country on my website. And hopefully I'll be getting a large grant this year to even scale it up more. So hopefully this won't be the only time you're hearing about it.
That's great.
Yeah, so.
Well, Kate Common, thank you so much for the book and for speaking with me today, and your powerful writing and teaching. I urge everyone to check out our website, katecommon.com, and to get the book and to dig further into these origins. It's called Undoing Conquest, Ancient Israel, the Bible, and the Future of Christianity. And I found it real helpful. So thank you, friends, for listening to this episode of the Nonviolent Jesus Podcast. You can hear more podcasts and find other upcoming Zoom programs at beatitudecenter.org. And you can sign up there to receive our free e-blast with news about upcoming podcasts and Zooms. Please tell your friends and coworkers about this podcast. And I hope you'll also get my new book, Universal Love, Surrendering to the God of Peace. If you're on Substack, you can look for me at Father John Deere. So, friends, may the God of peace bless you all. Let's keep on following the nonviolent Jesus and resisting war, conquest, fascism, and injustice, and work for a more just, more nonviolent country and world. See you all next time. God bless you.